Appreciate all of you who checked in on me and certainly prayed for me during that surgery this past week. I was telling some of the folks here that perhaps I should have heeded the doctor's advice when he said, you probably should have one of those surgeries done at a time and not both sides. And I said, I just want to get it over with, And now that it's over with, I'm glad I did it. But we had a couple bumps in the road, but I'm doing much better. Big shout out to Brother Tom Wilhite, who covered my Wednesday night Bible study for me, and I heard good reports about the Bible study and the people enjoying your message to them out of Colossians, and especially to Pastor Joel, who of course took on a great deal of those responsibilities. But I'm glad to be back and glad I can be here. The book of Proverbs, chapter 14, verse 30 says this: "A sound heart is the life of the flesh." In other words, if we're right with God and we're right with each other, it's going to help us physically. We're going to feel better and do better physically. A sound heart is the life of the flesh, but envy, the rottenness of the bones. I thought I'd bring a practical message. I wasn't even sure I was going to be here, but just something that really, to be honest with you, something I could alter the length of the message. If I wasn't feeling so good today, I might make it a quick message, but I'm feeling a little better than I thought I would be. But envy is the kind of thing that lies below the surface. You cannot detect envy in me, nor can I detect envy in you. It is something that we pretty much universally struggle with. It's described as rottenness of the bones. It can really destroy a person's life, his joy, his testimony, his walk with God. And the Bible says it defiles everything and all people who come in contact with it. Now, if you're like me, I began to detect a problem in this area early in my life. Even kids struggle with envy. Like Joseph here in our text passage, I had a large family. I had 7 brothers and 2 sisters. There's always something to envy when you're the middle child in with 10 kids. Somebody younger or older gets away with something that I don't get away with. But it spilled over into my school life. I had a very close friend in the 6th grade named Gary Azama. Now, Gary was a cool guy. In fact, everybody liked Gary. The staff loved Gary. He was a good student. All the other kids in school liked Gary. And for some odd reason, he chose me to be one of his friends. And we were closest of friends. And I love the fact that he wanted to hang out with me. We did things together away from the school campus. And then little things began to arise in our relationship that started to weigh on me a little bit. And perhaps it was my pride or whatever it was. But I remember that presidential fitness award thing they had. And there was a 50-yard dash. And Gary beat everybody in the 50-yard dash. And that sort of bothered me a little bit. Well, it didn't stop with that. We were in a PE class together, and we had to scrimmage for a couple weeks. And then there were so many students in that school, the coach or the teacher of the PE class would divide the students into 2 different categories, and they would divide down on 5-member teams, and they'd have competitions every week. And there was an A league and a B league. Well, I don't have to tell you what that means. The A League was for the people who had a little more basketball skill, or they could play a little bit better. And the B League was for those people that, were just learning how to play the sport. And Gary, of course, got chosen for the A League. And boy, was I surprised when I look at the list posted there in PE to find out that I was placed on the B League. I remember looking over at Gary. Now, Gary was probably up to my neck. He was a lot shorter than I was, and basketball was my sport. And when Gary got chosen for the A League and I got put on the B League, I remember looking across and seeing him play all the A League players while I'm playing in the B League. I was envious. I'll be honest with you. Well, basketball got over. I was happy to see that go. A humiliating time in the B League. And then we played flag football at the end of the school year. And then we had a couple of teams chosen up. And then you have to pick the positions on the team. Well, I was selected to play wide receiver because I was one of the taller kids, but by far and away, the best position, every red-blooded boy knows this, the best position to get on a competitive football team is what? Quarterback. Guess who got chosen, the quarterback on my team? So now it's building, this resentment, this envy is building in my heart toward my good friend. And here's the amazing thing. I never said a word to him about any of this. but it was affecting my relationship from the inside out. The final straw, however, was when I had a girlfriend named Sharon. And Sharon, by virtue of her relationship with me and Gary's friendship to me, Sharon met Gary. And Sharon, if I didn't know better, was kind of getting sweet on Gary a little bit. Now, I don't know if she really was or not. And it's sixth grade. Your relationships are not so, important. But I felt like he was flirting with her. And that was the final straw. I mean, now he's taken my quarterback position. He's taken my A-League position. He beat me in the Presidential Physical Fitness Award, and now he's taken my girlfriend from me. And I just cooled off my relationship with Gary, and he didn't understand why, but eventually he said, hey, he invited me over to a couple events. I didn't show up, and we grew apart. That was in the sixth grade. By the time we both hit the same junior high school, I really can't recall ever having a meaningful conversation with Gary ever again. I lost a good friend because I guess when you're in sixth grade, you don't have it within yourself to go up to a kid and say, hey, can I discuss my feelings with you? I mean, we don't do that. I just brooded and I envied him and I became jealous of him, and it destroyed a relationship. And the truth is, many of us here today, as adults, as teenagers, we still struggle with areas of envy. It's not something we grow out of, it seems, and sometimes it escalates as we get older in life. And it can really, truly, as the Bible says, cause rottenness of the bones. Now, you may know that you have a problem with it, and like myself, you maybe have gone to great lengths to justify it. You may want to blame the other person or whatever is going on in your heart and your life, but I hope and pray that after looking at this example here and recognizing the danger that envy can cause in our lives, you will be willing to at least assess your life and ask yourself, is this really holding me back or hurting me in my walk with God? Because I can promise you this, if nothing else, we'll all leave here in a moment and say, God is not pleased with our envy and our jealousy. If you're taking notes, I want you to write down, first of all, its presence. Envy is present all around us. It's a sin that's plagued mankind since the beginning, since the book of Genesis. You're reading those passages, Pastor Joel, you probably have come across a few already. I'm thinking of Cain and Abel, for instance. And David was described as a man after God's own heart. Here's a man that walked with God. He was not without his faults, but David had a very close relationship with the Lord, and he walked with God. He was called a man after God's own heart. And yet one day he was humble enough to admit that he was envious when he saw the prosperity of the wicked. He just came out and said it. I'm envious. This sin that's described as rottenness to the bones. Now, we commonly associate envy with material possessions. I want what you have. I envy you because you have a material thing. And it does affect that part of our relationship with God and with the Lord and with others. But it's not limited to material things. Sometimes we envy people for other reasons. Maybe they are popular, or they have a talent and ability that we don't have. Maybe they're engaged in meaningful relationships that seem to be lacking in our lives. Or it could be even in a spiritual realm. We could look at someone and say, wow, I wish I had a walk with God like that person has. A prayer life. I wish I was as disciplined in my Christian life as that person. Envy can affect any area of our lives. One of the major driving forces behind all the problems that the scribes and Pharisees had with Jesus, ultimately resulting in them arresting him, falsely accusing him, and putting him on a cross, is they envied his popularity. They envied his miracle-working power. They were jealous of him. Everything negative we read about here in Genesis chapter 37 with regard to Joseph's brothers. And here's a limited but accurate list of some of the things that happen in this text passage. We see anger evidenced. We see malice. We see a conspiracy. We see cruelty, callousness, deceit, and other things that would eventually happen. All of those had at their heart the sin of envy. They envied their brother, and it produced all these other negative reactions. When a person gives in to envy, there is no rest, there's no peace, there's no satisfaction. That's why James in the New Testament, chapter 3, verse 16, would ultimately say that with envy, you will find confusion and every evil work. James says, watch out for this. Watch out for this rottenness of the bones. It's going to cause problems for you. It's going to cause confusion in your life, and it's going to result in every evil work is associated with envy. Many factors, of course, come into play in this story to describe why his brothers were envious. We know from verse 2, and I really didn't pay attention to this before. I was planning on preaching a different message because we were to have our business meeting here, but I got some time in my office just away from everybody and was thinking about this passage, and I saw something I never saw before. Would you look back to verse 2? And there's something we can pick up about Joseph's brothers here. These are the generations of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was feeding the flock with his brethren. And the lad was with the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah. Those are his half-brothers, okay? He's out there working, shepherding the flocks. And it says, and his father's wives, and Joseph brought unto his father their evil report. So here's what happened here. They were messing up somehow. I don't know what it was. Maybe they were being lazy. Maybe they weren't doing the job right. Maybe they weren't putting their heart into their work. For whatever reasons, David said, well, there's something that's not right here, and I've got to make a decision that's going to jeopardize my relationship with my brothers. I'm going to tell my father what's going on here. I don't know. Again, I don't know what they were doing or what they were perhaps not doing, but he went and told his father that they were messing up in some area of their lives. I really didn't pay attention to that before. I thought it was all about the dreams. There's deeper problems going on here. With our young people, and certainly with my children when they were growing up, I tried to discourage tattletelling. For one thing, they'll be coming to you every hour if you have enough kids. They'll be coming to you all the time, telling you something. I discouraged that, not so much because I wearied of hearing things that were going on, but mostly because I know that tattletelling jeopardized the relationship between those children. It's true in a school setting or in a church setting. So sometimes when the kids, I've heard other staff members, particularly my wife, say this, when a kid has come up and said, Mrs. Miller, so-and-so, Emiliano did this. I don't want to hear it. Are you tattletelling? They don't get to tell all the salient details of something going on, and they walk away because they were just ready to get them in trouble. We try to discourage that. There is a time to be silent, the Bible says. But there's also a time to speak up. And according to Joseph's perspective here, this was a time to speak to his father about what his brothers were doing. That doesn't win you any brownie points with your brothers, I'll tell you that right now. But sometimes, I think many crimes and injustices and things that are perpetrated against innocent people could be prevented if people will do the right thing, and when it's time to be silent, they can be silent. When it's time to speak, it's time to speak. And I don't know how to teach children the right time to do that and when's the wrong time to do that. There's no easy solution to that. But I want to say this. I think there are many people that see the danger coming down the road and they keep silent on the matter, and people are hurt because they do not speak up. And Joseph decided that it was time for him to tell his dad what his brothers were doing, and that caused a problem there. But it went deeper than just that scenario that's approaching here. He might have been labeled as a goody two-shoes in this particular passage, but the bigger factor takes place in verse 3. Look at verse 3. Now Israel, it's another name for Jacob. His name was changed to Israel. Israel, Jacob, their father, loved Joseph more than all his children because he was the son of his old age and made him a coat of many colors. Not only did he love him more and keep it a silent matter or a secret matter, hey, Joseph, you're my favorite, but don't tell your brothers about it. No, he made it public. He made a special coat for him, a rare coat, a beautiful coat, something that would stand out from the crowd, and he wore it to show that he was the object of his father's favor. Now, obviously, this was not Joseph's fault. Absolutely not. This is something his father decided to do, to favor him. But when he did that, it caused a wedge in his relationship with his brothers, and that's where this rottenness of the bones began to develop, when they saw that their brother Joseph was favored over themselves. Every parent, wise parent, should look at this scenario here and do their best to try to avoid situations where you are playing favorites with your children. Now, again, I've told my kids, you can't treat every kid alike, right? They're all different. And they're all at different stages of life, unless you have twins or triplets. And even then, they're all different from each other. But the truth of the matter is, life isn't fair. Sometimes somebody's going to get something and somebody's not, and that's just the nature of life. You'd be wise to teach your children that lesson too, so that they don't grow up with this entitlement philosophy that if somebody else has something, I deserve to get it too. But a lot of the problems caused between Joseph and his brothers goes right to Jacob for openly favoring him above his other sons. And Satan doesn't need much sometimes in a family relationship. He will use the smallest thing, sometimes the silliest thing, to drive a wedge between family members and cause envy to raise its ugly head in a family relationship. And the results are predictable. They can be devastating. I already mentioned Cain and Abel. There was envy there. Abel's offering was accepted and Cain's was not, and he became envious and he killed his brother. First murder in the Bible, book of Genesis. Envy raised its ugly head with Ishmael and Isaac, and their relationship was damaged and were apart for years. There was envy between Jacob and Esau. You know that story and the tension in the relationship there, and certainly between Joseph and his brothers here. In every one of these instances, we can see that the disease the Bible calls rottenness of the bones crept in, it got festered, and it caused problems in human relationships. For whatever reasons, Joseph's brothers were overcome with envy, and they turned on their own brother, because we read in verse 4 that they hated him and could not speak peaceably with him. Yeah, you know someone's got a problem with you when they won't even say anything nice to you. You know, Gary Azama may have been completely in the dark about my feelings toward him, but my relationship with him sure showed that something was wrong. Verse 5 says they hated him yet the more. Verse 8 says they hated him yet the more. So their hatred was growing. They hated him yet the more for his dreams and for his words. And then verse 11 says, and his brethren envied him. Do you notice that the culmination of hatred is envy? We think hatred is so bad. Envy is more of a minor level. No, envy was the culmination of hatred. Growing, ongoing hatred in someone's life, envy is the result. And we're no different today. Hasn't really changed through the years. Envy is a ugly monster. Its presence is all around us, but notice secondly, its procedure. In the course of their work as shepherds, Joseph's older brothers went to Shechem, and he was sent by his father to check on them, just to kind of see how they were doing, maybe to bring them some provisions. And it's obvious that Jacob was not aware of the tension and animosity that had developed between his sons and his favorite son, Joseph. Because had he been aware of that, he probably would have sent somebody else. And he thought he was doing a good thing. I'll send Joseph, my favorite son, to go check on the others. The fact that he was back and the others were out doing the hard work may itself be another indication that Jacob was favoring Joseph. Let them do the dirty work, the shepherding. Let them do the hard work. You stay back with me. All right, it's time to go check on them, see how they're doing. Well, before he ever met up with them, they had developed this conspiracy against him. And that's the nature of envy. It's going to act out. It lies deep under the surface, but any moment it can strike and bring sudden destruction. Their intent was to kill him originally. And then they devised another plan. They took him, you know the story. They took the animal and they killed it and pretended to tell the story to Jacob that some wild beast had attacked Joseph and torn him to pieces. And here's that coat of many colors. Interesting. The object of his favoritism. It's now ripped and shredded and covered with blood. And this is what the animal's left of your son. He is gone. He is dead. And they blamed it on this evil beast. We're always going to be able to find some evil beast to throw into the equation to justify our envy. We'll find a character flaw or something about the person, that bothers us, or a contributing factor. Because he doesn't get along with her either. See, she told me what a rotten person he is. And you can always find some evil beast to blame the problem on as your scapegoat. People work at great lengths to justify their envy before God, but he knows the condition of our hearts. Reuben made a half-hearted attempt to rescue his brother, and there's something, again, very interesting in this passage I want you to look at, and I want you to understand the setting and what's going on here and think about this. But look at verse 24 of our text again. It says, those brothers, took Joseph, and cast him into a pit, and the pit was empty, and there was no water in it. Interesting that they would mention that. And then it says in the beginning of verse 25, and they, those brothers, sat down to eat bread. Well, it was lunchtime. They had to have their lunch. It didn't occur to them that they took their brother and threw him into a pit without even so much as a little bit of water there, not to mention no food. They're enjoying their lunch at the expense of their brother. Now, if you just take this passage alone, you're left to speculate on what it must have been like for Joseph. But we have some cross-references in the book of Amos and also in the New Testament that tell us what it was like for Joseph while he stayed in that pit for what was probably amounted to hours. While his brothers were up there having their lunch, eating their food. They sat down to eat bread. He was within earshot of his brothers. Now, I don't know about you, but I would have said, hey guys, this isn't funny. Initially, I would have been like, hey, come on, guys, all right, come on, get me out of here. And then that would have turned to anger, and ultimately that would turn to despair. I'm hungry. I'm thirsty. I may die. Their intentions are not good. I might die here. And how hard-hearted of it was them to just go and have their lunch if there was nothing wrong. Now, in the book of Amos, he alludes to this story, this passage, this setting that's going on here. And he talks about those brothers, what it was like for them when they were having their lunch and their brother was in this pit. He says that they drank wine in bowls, but they were not grieved for the affliction of Joseph. While they had their meal, they didn't care that he was in that pit, crying out for his life. 20 years later, when the same brothers realized what they had done and that God was judging them for that and that Joseph was still alive and that they were in a very difficult situation, they looked back on their decision, what they had done that day. They regretted it, and they said this. It casts a little bit more information on this setting. 20 years later, in Genesis chapter 42, they said, we saw the anguish of his soul when he besought us, and we would not hear. So Joseph was apparently crying out to his brothers, crying out in anguish, in desperation. He was suffering, and they didn't care a bit for him. If you want to know what envy can do in your life and in my life today, there's a good picture of it right there. It's what his own brothers, out of their own mouths, they said 20 years later, we saw his anguish and did nothing to alleviate his suffering. How hard-hearted, how cruel, and how uncaring is the nature of envy. Well, you know the story. They decided to take him out and make some money on him. Maybe they had a little bit of a conscience after all and sold him to some Ishmaelites, and they took him as a prisoner and as a servant, as a slave. And the brothers still contrived this story to take this coat, cover it with blood, brought it back to their father. The father learns apparently of his son's untimely death, the son who was his object of his favor. You can imagine the grief it caused their aged father. He's grieving over the loss of his son, as any parent would over the loss of a child. And the height of their hypocrisy is found in verse 35 when it says, and all his sons and all his daughters rose up to comfort him. How phony, how fake, how hard-hearted envy had developed in their life to the point that they saw their father's legitimate anguish, and they were pretending to comfort him, knowing full well that he was still alive, that they could have taken him out of his pain and suffering by saying, Dad, we messed up. We sold him as a slave. We'll go get him back. He's still alive. Envy will do that to a person's heart. It will harden their heart. There's no limit to what it will do. So we see its presence, its procedure. I want you to see finally its plight. Because of their envy, Joseph was first thrown into a pit and then into a dungeon. And he had to endure all these untold amounts of suffering in different settings. And just when the light began to shine at the end of the tunnel, somebody would snuff it out again. And things would get better, and then they got much worse. And he was mistreated in every possible way. I want you to think of all the time that he lost with his family. Prior to that, he was just a teenager going through life. Life was simple. Life was good. His dad loved him, and he loved his dad. He probably cared for his brothers. But all those opportunities were suddenly taken from his life with no possible hope of remedying it. He suffered for many years as a prisoner. He He was blamed for things he did not do. His very life was at stake. Think of the opportunities he would have had to be with his dad, the one that loved him, and just share time with his dad while he still had his dad alive. And now it wasn't just that his dad was out of the picture. He didn't know what was going on with his dad. He didn't know if his dad was still alive. His brothers robbed him of all those opportunities, stolen forever. I wonder, however, whether this tragedy and this hardship would have compared to what the brothers were going through when they realized day after day after day, when they saw their dad breaking down in front of them, that being overcome with sorrow almost to the point of death, and the hardship that it brought upon his life. I wondered how they felt. I wonder if they had any conviction. See, in spite of all the things that happened to Joseph, he was able to say, you guys meant it for bad, for evil, but God meant it for what? Good. This is not the life I would have picked for myself, but God was in control, and God meant good of all this. I'm a better person. He said, I'm a better person because of this. His brothers could never say that. For 20 long years, they were riddled with guilt and conviction for what they had done in deceiving their father and mistreating Joseph. And a person who is right with God, in spite of his circumstances, is always going to do much better than a person who is not right with God. And they were suffering in their own right. Eventually, Joseph was exalted. Eventually, these same brothers were sent to Egypt to beg food. And when they figure out that this assistant to Pharaoh was none other than their long-lost brother, they were just, I'm sure, convinced they were going to be killed in a moment. Envious person may succeed at bringing harm to someone, but ultimately, in the long run, they are the ones that will suffer the most. There's a true story of a Greek athlete. The Greeks were big on athletic events and competitions, and their most skilled athletes were given almost godlike recognition in their culture and society. And there was a very gifted athlete who won many of the sporting events of his day, and he was heralded as a great hero. And his fellow competitors decided to honor him in a way, and so they decided to make a statue in his likeness and erect this statue in a public place so all could walk by and see a likeness of this great athlete and honor him and worship him. Well, there was one of his competitors who didn't like the idea because he was envious. He didn't like the idea that they were building a statue to this guy. He had beaten him in competitive events many times, and he grew to be resentful of this great athlete. And rather than honor him or revere him, he despised him. And so when they erected that statue in his honor in a public place, he came at night with every intent to destroy that statue. He was able to disconnect the statue of this athlete from its pedestal, but in doing so, you probably imagine what happened next. That statue fell on him, pinned him, and crushed him, and he died during the night. True story. What an apt picture of what envy will do to you and I. It'll snuff the life out of us. Gary didn't know I had any problems with him. Maybe Joseph didn't realize until the day of his fateful, when he was cast into that pit, that his brothers hated him or despised him like that. But it really hurts the person who is carrying these ill feelings towards others. They're the ones who truly suffer. And truly the Bible is right in calling it the rottenness of the bones. Now, I don't know. This is not the message I was intending to preach this Sunday, so I can only assume that God intended it for somebody here, maybe for nobody else, maybe me, I don't know. But if you are struggling with envy, or you've justified it in your life and you blame the other person or the other people, or you blame your circumstances, or maybe even blame God, I can tell you from the truth of Scripture that you are the one that's going to be hurt the most because of your envy. And sometimes you alone are the one that's going to be hurt. And when you are hurt, you will hurt other people. Hurt people hurt people. I've said that oftentimes in the past. Hurt people hurt people. And when people are envious, they hurt others. Look what Joseph's brothers did. Look what Cain did. Look at the many examples in Scripture when people are envious or jealous what they do. And I want you to recognize this sin for what it is today. It is disastrous. It's destructive. It's full of malice and hatred and conspiracy and violence. It is a wicked, dangerous sin. So recognize it for what it is. Don't toy with it. Don't play with it. Don't allow it to stay in your life. If there's something or someone that you envy and it's starting to eat away at you, recognize it for the potential that it can cause in your life. And I say today, be rid of it. Just be rid of it. In some cases, it's wise to go to the person that you envy and say, hey, I just want you to know I've been harboring bad feelings toward you. I don't say that's the best route always. If I would have gone to my friend Gary, I mean this, and said, hey, Gary, I just want you to know for the last several weeks, I've been bothered that you made the A-League in basketball. You got chosen quarterback on the team, and you beat me in the 50-yard dash, and you're flirting with my girlfriend. I just want you to know I'm getting jealous of you. Gary would have probably laughed, slapped me on the back, and everything would have been okay. That's it, 6th grade. You're not into it too deep, you know. And you may go to the person that you envy, if it's a person, and say, in a very transparent way, I'm harboring some bad feelings of resentment. I'm jealous of you. I'm envious of you. Well, here's the problem with that. They may look at you and say or infer that you have every right to be envious of them because, after all, they're superior to you. And that's not going to help give you warm, fuzzy feelings to getting that taken care of. So that's a risky move. Maybe that's not the best route for you to go, but here's what you can do today. You can go before your Heavenly Father and say, I've had bad feelings towards someone. It's not right. It's eating away at me. It is truly the rottenness of the bones. It is wrong. It is sin. I recognize it as such. I confess it as such. And God, I ask for your help. You can do that today. And that will put you back on the road where you need to be.